Hello, everyone. Thanks to all of you who joined us in the morning, and thank you to the newcomers joining us right now. I'm Neeti Nair, and you are attending the second session of the day-long symposium on citizenship, belonging, and the partition of India. It is my privilege to introduce the moderator for the second session. Sonam Kachru is assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, and I will be pasting, or he will be pasting bios in the chat session shortly. Thank you all, and we look forward to having a good conversation in the next few hours. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Neeti, and welcome everyone to the second section of this conference, Citizenship, Belonging, and the Partition of India. It's an exciting session entitled Literature and History, Longing and Belonging, and we have a fabulous group of panelists, Shahla Hussain, Uttara Shahani, Atrazia, and Meher Farooqi. My name is Sonam Kachru, as Neeti said. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Virginia. My area of interest, and such expertise as I have, which is very modest, lies in the history of philosophy in ancient India, where the world was very differently articulated in terms of its political borders and its geographies of imagination. I'll link to my website here if you'd like to follow up more. But I am an outsider to this conference and therefore thrilled to be here. I've learned a very great deal from the papers, as I'm sure all of you will as well. And I have been a fan of the work of these scholars for some time, so it's a particular privilege for me to be here. I'll introduce each panelist before the talks, as has happened before, and I'll link to their websites in the chat for fuller descriptions, and you can learn more about them and their work. As before, we will have Q&A for our panelists after all the papers have been delivered. So please hold on to your questions or write them in to the chat, and just give me a brief note saying whether to whom the question is directed, if it's an individual, or just say that it's for the panel as a whole. And I'll do my best to keep up with them, I promise. Our next speaker, Uttara Shahani, is a lawyer and historian of modern South Asia. She works on Sindh and the Sindh diaspora, partitions, refugee migration, citizenship, and the histories of ecumenical traditions of religious practices. I'm going to put her writings here. She's currently postdoctoral researcher at the Refugee Studies Center, University of Oxford, and she'll be speaking to us now about language without a land, linguistic citizenship, and the case for Sindhi in India. Uttara, it's yours.
Thank you, Sonam, and thanks, Neeti, for organizing this wonderful gathering. This is an extract from a longer paper I'm still developing on linguistic citizenship and territoriality with reference to the Sindhi diaspora in India. The paper first situates a history of Sindhi Hindu resistance to linguistically defined provinces and territorializing linguistic belonging before partition during the movement for the separation of Sindh from Bombay. This resistance to the formation of linguistic states continued after partition, when Sindhi partition refugees found themselves a linguistic, electoral, and cultural minority without a linguistic province to which they could claim belonging in India. The paper then examines the Sindhi refugee campaign to include Sindhi in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, why different classes of refugees sought this inclusion, and the assorted arguments they made on the necessity of representation in the 8th schedule. The 21st Constitutional Amendment Act of 1967 made Sindhi the first new language added to the original list of the 8th schedule of the Constitution. After the Sindhi campaign, the 8th schedule became an instrument to support minority languages, which was not its original purpose. Consequently, the longer paper, which I won't be going into that many details today, will look at the implications the Sindhi refugee campaign had for broadening the scope of the Constitution to recognize and support other linguistic minorities, such as the speakers of Nepali and Santali, whose relationship with territory was not coterminous with a linguistic state, and who referenced the Sindhi campaign in their own battles for recognition. Resisting the linguistic province before partition. In 1936, the colonial government of India separated the province of Sindh from the Bombay Presidency under the aegis of the Government of India Act 1935. In the 1920s, the long-standing administrative demand for the separation of Sindh changed into a movement to free Muslim majority Sindh from Hindu majority Bombay. The movement for separation attracted the attention of all India political formations such as the Indian National Congress, the Muslim League, and the Hindu Mahasabha, who debated the demand in terms of the consequences both of territorializing communal representation as well as linguistic identity. In these debates, the question of provincial autonomy and minority rights was linked to the formation of linguistic provinces as well as to the idea of, in quotes, religious freedom. The Congress leadership, which had declared its support for the constitution of provinces on a linguistic basis, had already divided its provincial committees on linguistic lines, at odds with the actual internal boundaries of colonial India. The Nehru Report on Constitutional Reforms of 1928 agreed that separation should eventually take place, as Sindh constituted an independent linguistic unit. The Congress itself hoped to come to an agreement with the League on Jinnah's Delhi Muslim proposals of 1927 so that the League would give up its support for separate electorates in exchange for, amongst other things, the separation of Sindh from Bombay. Thus, it was at this stage the territorialization of minority representation became a cause of intense constitutional debate. Elite Sindhi Hindus from the professional and mercantile Amil Bhaiband castes opposed separation. They feared that it would threaten their own political and economic dominance in the province. Anti-separationists disputed the claim in the Nehru Report of 1928 that Sindh constituted a definite linguistic region. They asked why, if the separation of Sindh was being accepted based on language, Gujarat should continue its connection with Bombay. They pointed to the multilingualism of both Bombay and Sindh, with some arguing that Sindhi, in quotes, was not a homogeneous language, and that the standardization of the language and its script was a product of colonial rule. These arguments were not dissimilar to post-colonial scholarly critiques on British policies of enumeration and homogenization of languages and colonial understandings of India's religious minorities. In the run-up to Sindh's separation, anti-separationists resisted the propositions that language or religion should be mapped onto a defined provincial territorial identity. They insisted that the territorialization of cultural identity would only serve to create new minorities. And that they were not willing to accept this diminished position for themselves. Their resistance ultimately proved futile. However, they were soon to make similar arguments after they became a linguistic and cultural minority as refugees without a territory in India. It was only a decade after Sindh's separation from Bombay that partition took place. Sindh's partition in 1947 involved no division of territory. It was a deterritorialized and demographic partition producing approximately 1 million non-Muslim refugees, not all of them Sindhi speaking. Since partition, the lack of a Sindh in India, specifically the lack of a historic territory to which they could claim attachment, has shaped the Sindhis' relationship with the Indian Republic and their fellow citizens. Sindhi partition refugees moved in their largest numbers to Bombay, with which Sindh had only recently ended a long relationship. They also moved to the Western principalities. Joya Chatterjee suggests partition refugees moved not only to the new nations of India and Pakistan, but to the princely states, because they seem to offer some constancy in an atmosphere of fear and upheaval, believing that the princes would protect and shelter them better than India or Pakistan. The Western and even some southern principalities and different Sindhi communities, from pastoralists to traders, had long enjoyed a mutually dependent relationship. Deterritorialization and the minoritization that went hand in glove with it also played a part in the movement of Sindhi refugees to the princely states. Sindhi refugees were not nominally a religious minority, but local communities could view their heterodox Hinduism and locally incomprehensible caste relations as suspect. The absence of their own linguistic region also marked them out as a minority. Sindhis hoped they would find succor with the princes, where at first the Indian government was averse to evacuating them from Pakistan, and where later the provincial governments, especially Bombay, were loath to rehabilitate more of their numbers. The princely states appeared to offer an opportunity to belong on terms that were not defined by regional or linguistic boundaries, although some had become extremely communally polarized, and I think we can think of Alwar here. After partition, the prospect of the end of monarchical rule in the states and the re-emergence of demands to divide India along linguistic lines heightened Sindhi refugee fears that nativist sentiment against them in Bombay and in Marathi and Gujarati-speaking regions would worsen. As Oliver Godsmark points out, some of the communities who felt most threatened by the plan for Samyukta Maharashtra were linguistic minorities, Gujarati, Kannada, and Sindhi speakers. The Constituent Assembly had appointed the Dar Commission in 1948 to inquire into the desirability of linguistic provinces. The Dar Commission opposed the creation of new linguistic provinces, arguing that they would, and I quote, immediately bring into existence a new kind of minority problem which did not exist before. In heterogeneous provinces, it is not possible for any linguistic group residing in the province to call any area, even its homeland, exclusively its own, and to regard any person residing there as an alien or an outsider. But the moment a province is allotted to a majority linguistic group, and that group forms a majority government in it, it begins to regard the area as exclusively belonging to that particular linguistic group and to treat all persons not belonging to that group and speaking a different language as outsiders and aliens, close quote. The Commission pointed out that if new linguistic states were to be created, then agitations over the question of the integration of the parts of the princely states that were linguistically contiguous with linguistic provinces would require an, in quotes, immediate solution. Both the dissolution of the princely states and the proposals to create linguistic provinces from the large states that were leftovers of the presidencies of British India posed a threat to different minority groups. Sindhi Congress leaders wanted to secure representation in the Bombay legislature despite being an electoral minority and feared that these desires would become even more unachievable in the proposed state of Maharashtra. Moreover, they linked the failure of refugee rehabilitation to nativist regionalisms. The veteran Sindhi congressman Choitram Gidwani, who had also opposed the separation of Sindh, accused his fellow Congress workers of not taking the task of refugee rehabilitation seriously because they harbored a vicious spirit, in quotes, of provincialism and hostility towards the refugees. As late as 1987, some 30 years after the passage of the States Reorganization Act 1956, Sindhi organizations were writing to Rajiv Gandhi to scrap, in quotes, all linguistic states in India for, in quotes, the sake of unity and integrity. And if this was not possible, to grant Sindhis a province of their own in India. Their arguments reiterated Nehru's and the Dar Commission's apprehensions that linguistic reorganization would raise the possibility of further partitioning and would threaten the prospect of the survival of India. But in the absence of a linguistic state to which they could lay claim, Sindhi refugees looked for alternative ways to secure representation as a political and cultural minority. They identified the recognition of Sindhi in the 8th schedule of the Constitution as one such novel route, one that would also ensure certain economic benefits. When the Indian Constitution came into force in January 1950, the 8th schedule only named a select group of 14 languages with, in quotes, official status. Apart from Sanskrit and Urdu, the rest were aligned to a compact linguistic region, although Urdu became an official language of Jammu and Kashmir. The criteria used for a language's inclusion in the schedule's original list of 14 was that it was a so-called major or developed language, considered developed enough to be used, as Shakira Jabin says, across different domains and to augment Hindi. As R.S. Gupta and Anvita Abhi have pointed out, these criteria were arbitrary and did not explain several exclusions. Inclusion in the schedule also meant representation on the Official Languages Commission set up in 1955. One of the main purposes of the commission was to make recommendations to the government on the progressive use of Hindi for official purposes and to restrict the use of English. Sindhis who pursued the inclusion of Sindhi in the 8th schedule consequently made several arguments on Sindhi's developed status, such as the fact that the language had a current literature and a hoary past, and hence had the ability to enrich Hindi. The Sindhi Hindus, and I use the term Hindu very broadly, who arrived at partition were not the only speakers of Sindhi and related languages in India. Neither are all the Sindhi speakers in India Hindu. But it was a group of refugee Sindhi writers and educationists who first made the demand to recognize Sindhi in the 8th schedule in 1949. The writers recalled their campaign to include Sindhi in the 8th schedule as essential, not as a project to enrich Hindi, but to reviving a sense of Sindhi cultural identity or Sindhyat in a community scattered all over India and the world, and as a campaign to stem language shift in the diaspora. For them, language was the fulcrum around which a socio-cultural identity could be regenerated. Recently, Matt Cook and Maya David have argued that language shift facilitates the reproduction of core cultural modalities among diaspora Sindhis rather than suppresses them. But in the immediate aftermath of partition, the 8th schedule offered, as Rita Kothari has pointed out, a symbolic recognition of the literati's Indianness in quotes and a means of overcoming their invisibility in cultural spaces. A section of the 8th schedule campaigners emphasized Sindhi's connections to Sanskrit in their case for how it could enrich Hindi, in addition to emphasizing an Indo-Aryan and in quotes Vedic heritage. They also invoked Mohenjo-daro in Sindh as the site of the Indus Valley civilization and therefore historically an inalienable part of India. In seeking inclusion with these arguments, this section of Sindhis were trying to identify themselves as Hindus, that is, as part of the majority in a country with a claim to all of India, if not a linguistic state. Farhan has also written about this in her previous book. But they simultaneously distinguished themselves as a minority in need of constitutional protection, a contradiction that resurfaced in a variety of ways. The controversy between Sindhis over whether to drop the Arabic Naskh script, in which Sindhi is most commonly written, for Devanagari has been addressed by others, and I won't go into it now. But it was also related to the arguments concerning establishing indigeneity as Hindu Indians. Partition represented a significant and humiliating fall in status in terms of class as well as caste for Sindh's upper and middle class Hindus, including the literati. To add insult to injury, local communities, as Subhadra Anand and Rita Kothari have shown, could describe Sindhis as vulgar, lacking in culture, and representative of the worst excesses of the Banya caste. Consequently, for certain sections of the erstwhile Hindu cultural, political, and economic elite of Sindh, the importance of the formal recognition of Sindhi as a major language of, in quotes, continuous tradition acquired enormous significance. The ranks of Sindhi refugees were filled with lawyers who had paid keen attention, alongside non-lawyers in the community, to constitutional developments. Inserting themselves into the language of the constitution, to use Rohit Dey's framework, provided one method of communicating with the state, particularly the center. This was perhaps not such a curious development if one considers, as Day has pointed out, how quickly the constitution became a part of the everyday life of Indians and the dominant field for politics, especially for minorities. The files of the Commissioner for Linguistic Minorities reveal another layer to the 8th schedule campaign, which are to do with the urgency of material concerns. They reveal the great desire of Sindhi parents for support for Sindhi medium schools for their children, but which was proving difficult to receive at the provincial level. In their appeals to the Commissioner for Linguistic Minorities to grant Sindhi special status in the Constitution, Sindhi parents made complaints about the refusal of grants and aid to Sindhi schools, the refusal to teach Sindhi as a language subject to Sindhi pupils in secondary schools, and the change of the medium of instruction from Sindhi to Hindi or the regional language. Their anxiety to ensure support for education in Sindhi in both primary and secondary schools was not just a means of preserving the language for cultural reasons, but also economic. Poorer Sindhis did not want to be disadvantaged educationally and in the competition for jobs by losing the right to education in the quote's mother tongue. Representations for special status for Sindhi so that education in Sindhi became a priority came from refugee parents settled in the camps such as Bairagarh outside Bhopal and Ulhasnagar outside Bombay. Sindhi refugees often needed to learn more than one new language to stay afloat, and this burden was felt acutely in the refugee camps. Many refugees spoke only Sindhi, I mean, in contrast to, say, maybe the Bengali and Punjabi refugees who had uh, belonged to the same linguistic group quite often of the places where they settled, and had to acquire Marathi, Hindi, or Gujarati, and some English. In 1953, 65.8% of household heads of Sindhi refugee families in Bombay could not read, write, or speak or understand the local languages. The proportion for government refugee camps was 75.4%. For several years, the central government opposed the call to include Sindhi in the 8th schedule, insisting that the demand arose from a misapprehension of the constitutional provisions. Furthermore, the Home Ministry expressed the fear that the inclusion of Sindhi would open the floodgates to other minority linguistic groups, making similar demands that would require a commitment from the government for support. Finally, after some writers camped out in Delhi until their demand was met, and in the words of the writer Popati Hiranandani, after relentless petitions, agitations, and long waiting, including several interventions from the Commissioner for Linguistic Minorities, Sindhi became the first new language to find inclusion in the 8th schedule in 1967. This inclusion forced open the possibility that other minority languages not aligned to or not the majority language of a territorially defined linguistic state deserved central recognition and support from the 8th schedule in addition to any other benefits they might get. Since Sindhi was added to the 8th schedule, constitutional amendments have added Konkani, Meitei, and Nepali in 1992, and Bodo, Dogri, Maithili, and Santali in 2003. The movements to include these languages all refer to Sindhi's inclusion, pointing out that the number of Sindhi speakers was much smaller than that of, say, Nepali or Santali. They made the argument that the constitution was not designed to force a correlation between a specific territory and a language, and in the process rejecting a form of majoritarian citizenship and certain geographical imaginations of the nation. The 8th schedule continues to accord differential status to Indian languages, and the government has been evasive about when and how further languages will be recognized, although there are demands to include at least 38 more. But after the inclusion of Sindhi, the potential remains to expand it much further. Whether this potential will be met is open to question. Thank you.